Concern over rape is mounting in this community. Many of the same women at this workshop will gather again next month for a sheriff's talk on safety in the neighborhood. Susan Hahn, KCRA News.
Well, I think that it's a very serious situation. I think it's very dangerous. I think that the reason there hasn't been something done about it is because it's a crime against women.
I imagine a lot of women in the area are scared and are nervous. If they could just kind of get to know each other's habits, their neighbors' habits, and call in if they see or hear anything suspicious at all.
He did enter a house where there were other people present outside of the victim. He bound his victim. There was a knife used, and he was wearing a mask or hood of some sort.
I don't know. I have a gun, but I still don't feel safe being, at home alone.
I am Anne-Marie Schubert, and this is Inside the Crime Files.
Welcome to Inside the Crime Files with Anne-Marie Schubert. I am Anne-Marie Schubert, and this podcast takes listeners inside and behind the scenes of the investigation and prosecution of some of the most horrific and notorious criminal cases in California history. We also examine unique techniques, innovative ideas, and inspirational stories that have come out of these cases.
This is the first of a series of episodes on the Golden State Killer.
Perhaps there's no better example of that innovation and those unique techniques than People versus Joseph DeAngelo, also known by many folks as the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and obviously most well known now as the Golden State Killer. In this episode, we will focus on the complex detective work and the newest and the greatest advancement in DNA technology that was used in this particular case. I'm super excited today to be joined by former Sacramento County Sheriff's Homicide Detective Ken Clark, Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office Investigator Paul Holes, as well as two folks from the Sacramento District Attorney's Office, and that is Kirk Campbell and Monica Zajkowski. Welcome, everybody. I'm super happy to have you here. And let me just start off with having some folks do some introductions. So Kenny, if it's okay to call you Kenny.
Sure.
Ken Clark, can you just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and what you did for the Sheriff's Department before you retired?
Sure. Well, I started as a deputy sheriff in 1992, did my time in the jails patrol. And then once I was finished with patrol, I promoted to detective. Went initially to the Robbery Bureau in 2003 and then got moved over to homicide in 2005. So I spent about 16, 17 years as a detective working in that area. And then in 2015, I promoted to sergeant and spent a stint back at the jail for about a year and then returned to homicide as the sergeant. And I was there at the time. I was one of the three sergeants there when this arrest was made.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kenny. All right, Paul, how about you?
Yeah, I started with the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Crime Lab back in 1990 as a civilian forensic scientist. And then after about 3 years, became a deputy sheriff criminalist doing crime scene investigation, assigned to the serology unit, and then ultimately promoted my way up over time to where I was the division commander over the forensic sciences division for the sheriff's office. During this time, I became interested in all the unsolved cold cases in Contra Costa County, including the East Area Rapist case. And then ultimately, I ended my career as a cold case investigator with the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office.
Excellent, Paul. And I'll probably ask you later about that phone call I made to you sometime probably around 2000 about this cold case that was happening and hopefully our efforts to get it solved.
Yep.
All right, Kirk, how about you? Let us know what you do and how you got into this business.
I'm probably I'm going to show my age here by saying that I started with the Folsom Police Department as a reserve police officer in 1983. Went down to Santa Ana Police Department when I graduated from college and worked there for a couple of years. And then in 1986 came up to back to Sacramento, working for the Sacramento Police Department. Had a lot of fun there. Got to do a lot of interesting assignments. I worked in the K-9 unit, the air support unit, where I was promoted to a sergeant, then eventually went over back to the detectives and retired in 2011 as a supervisor in the homicide unit. and was fortunate enough to come over to the DA's office, where I've been working since 2011, and I'm currently a lieutenant in our homicide gangs unit with the DA's office, and fortunate to be working with Monica and doing cold case work.
Excellent. All right, Monica, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I actually started at the DA's office as an intern and just never left. I've been there almost 25 years now. Starting in 2014, when Anne Marie became DA, I started working on various cold case and DNA projects. And since 2018, Kirk and I have been working on investigative genetic genealogy.
Yeah, and for the listeners, just to get a little more background about Monica, before she started working on DNA projects in 2014, she worked on a lot of DNA related things even before that, a number of different things that we've worked on in the office, but she is one incredible analyst in our office, so that's for sure. Okay, so let's start off, and I think most of the listeners probably are very familiar with the crimes that Joseph DeAngelo committed, but Kenny, if I can have you start off, and then maybe Paul kind of fill in. Ken, if you can talk about just briefly the crimes that originated in Visalia and in Sacramento.
Sure. So in the early 70s, a series of ransacking burglaries that were sexually motivated began in Visalia, California, which is down in Tulare County, about halfway between Sacramento and LA. During those crimes, an unknown offender at the time was breaking into homes, not taking anything of significant value, leaving behind or leaving a clear MO pattern of break-in style that was unique to him. They were able to differentiate that. He had moved around an area near the College of the Sequoias, and it also then branched out just south of, I believe it's Highway 198, which runs kind of east-west through Visalia. And during those crimes, he extensively prowled the neighborhood. He was a peeping Tom, did not show the same level of care that we later see in terms of concealing his face. And he was seen by individuals back then in the course of his activities. And over about 100 plus burglaries, it culminated in an attempted abduction of a young lady in her home in the middle of the night. And her father woke up. The father was a professor at the College of the Sequoias. His name was Claude Snelling. And during this abduction attempt, he was awakened by the noises. He came out into the yard area where our offender, who we now know to be Mr. DeAngelo, was moving her away from the yard and safety. The father confronted him, Mr. Snelling confronted him, and DeAngelo responded by shooting Mr. Snelling, which allowed his daughter to get away. And he unfortunately passed from his injuries. DeAngelo escaped, and they were able to link the firearm that was used in that case to a Visalia ransacker burglary that had occurred not too far away. He remained pretty inactive for a brief period of time and then picked up activity again around the college. The law enforcement officers and detectives working with Visalia PD at the time had noticed a pattern where he would emerge in a certain area and begin targeting some victims that he had previously targeted when he had come into a stressful time or had maybe potentially been seen by somebody, had a close encounter. So they set up surveillances in those areas and secreted detectives in garages of potential target victims. And Mr. DeAngelo appeared in December following the murder, which occurred in September of 1975. And so about 3 months later, he's seen by a detective who confronts him. He is unmasked at the time, but does have the ski mask on top of his head, kind of ready to be pulled down. And there is a brief standoff between them that ultimately results in Mr. DeAngelo shooting an officer from the Visalia Police Department by the name of McGowan. The officer wasn't hit by the bullet, fortunately. It fragmented a piece of his flashlight and caused some injuries to his face and eyes from that. And DeAngelo was able to escape. He goes off the radar in Visalia pretty much after that offense, and then pops up on our radar here in Sacramento in June of 1976.
Fair to say that when you say popped up in June of 76, that was kind of what began his reign of terror in the Sacramento region, all the way up until he left and went to the Bay Area and ultimately to Southern California.
Yes, that's correct.
So
And,
how many, just for the listeners, if you can just give them a sense of how many sexual assaults, and then obviously the homicide involving the young couple, the Maggiore couple, how many sexual assaults would you say there were?
In Sacramento County, I believe it was around 30, give or take. A couple of them were just outside the area in neighboring counties before he moved over to the Bay Area, which Paul will talk about, and then Southern California. But he was very prolific here in about a 18-month period of time between June of 76 and the late winter of 78.
Okay, and then the culmination part of, I mean, obviously the most horrific situation here was the culmination of the murder of Katie and Brian Maggiore. And what year was that in?
That was February the 2nd of 1978.
Okay. All right, so Paul, tell us a little bit, just in short summary, what the crime spree was with the Bay Area and then ultimately Southern California.
Yeah, in October of 78, we had our first attack in Concord, California, which is about maybe an hour, 15-minute drive south of Sacramento. And very quickly, because of the distinctive MO of the East Area Rapist, it was linked to the Sacramento series. And then over the course of the next almost 10 months, we had multiple attacks up and down the I-680 corridor in jurisdictions such as Walnut Creek, Danville, Fremont, as far south as San Jose. And, coming from Sacramento, this is almost a 3-hour drive down to where those attacks occurred from Sacramento. So the East Area Rapist was covering a very large geography. And then in June of 1979, he had one attempt attack back up in my jurisdiction, Contra Costa County, where the attack went sideways. The man got up and confronted him. A woman ran out of the house, and the East Area Rapist ran out of the house, and then he disappeared from Northern California.
Over the years, fair to say there was tremendous amount of work that was done by investigators really all over California that had cases. And that's really what the purpose of this podcast is to really highlight the really innovative ideas that were done in attempts to solve this. Paul, for you and me, I recall a phone call to you probably somewhere around 2000. I was working in what we call our rape unit at the time. Asked our office to see if we could find those rape kits and solve the East Area Rapist. And that's, I think, how long we've known each other since that phone call. I didn't know, I cold called you if my memory is right, and just talked to you. And fortunately, you had found those rape kits in Contra Costa, which ultimately led to the linking of all of these cases to the Northern California cases to the Southern California ones.
Yeah, and that was the fortunate aspect that I had, is my sheriff's office was the only agency in Northern California that had actually kept those sexual assault kits all these years. All the other agencies, just due to statute of limitations, or at least what was understood at the time as statute of limitations, they had expired and they had destroyed the kits. So I had 3 kits where ultimately I found DNA evidence from each kit, and using an old DNA technology showed, hey, it looks like it's the same offender. And then around the time frame that you called, which that was the first time I knew anybody else had an interest in the case, as Anne Marie, when you called me, that was when I'm doing a little telephonic, actually in 97, where it was like, well, maybe there's something down in Southern California, but it wasn't until 2001 when we had the actual link using a newer DNA technology, the short tandem repeats, or STRs. And that's when you and I had lots of conversations at that point, because you were trying to organize, a multi-jurisdictional meeting and try to get everybody on the same page. And, I don't know what happened exactly, but it seemed like that just didn't get off the ground.
Well, obviously, it all came together in 2018. But one of the things I want to talk about today is just some of the amazing work you all did on this case. And Ken, you started your investigation on this case around 2005, if my memory's right. And one of the projects you had was what I'll call the burglary project. And maybe you can kind of just share with the listeners what that was and what your goal was on that.
Sure. So one of the big questions we had was, did the offender start in Visalia and then move up here and then go back down to Southern California? Or was it some other combination of geography that he had done? So we were concerned that maybe he had previously been here in Sacramento. And we also wanted to make sure that Visalia was not just a similar crime versus being directly linked, because we didn't have DNA between those cases. So what I did was went back through and tried to figure out what reports I could examine from the era when he was operating in Visalia, and also before that period of time, to determine what he was doing geographically in regards to the Sacramento area. There was some report issues. They were regularly purging reports, and I got into basically the first I had access to that was not purged was 1973. And so I read the reports from 1973, and I saw the emergence in early 73, I mean, immediately after the new year, of an offender who came to be known as the Cordova Meadows burglar, and then ultimately was linked as well to a series of burglaries that were called the Cordova Cat burglary series. And the MO of the offender was strikingly similar to the ransacker, and also had a relationship with the East Area Rapist and those crimes. It definitely showed me that it appeared that the offender had begun here in Sacramento, had gone down to Visalia, and then come back here again for the East Area Rapist series. And we did notice that around the late spring and early summer of 1973, he disappears from the record in California, or I'm sorry, in Sacramento. And that is around the time that there's rumblings of him in Visalia, which would be consistent with his DeAngelo's application process and the events he had going on with the Exeter Police Department.
I mean, I think it's fascinating to see. I used to talk about this a lot, that pretty much every list known to man was created in this case in an effort to find a name. And I often said it was a needle in a haystack. And so that project that you started, it didn't ever reveal his name, right? But it definitely showed some patterns and MOs that obviously led you to believe it was quite possible he was the same person, right?
Yes. And I mean, there was always the hope that somebody in the course of those crimes that we were investigating from way back then, all the way through his EAR crimes, because I read all the attendant crimes in 76 through 78 as well. So I read all those reports. The hope was that somebody had seen a license plate,
Right.
in some way identified him. Hey, that's Joe. He's the guy that I see at Bel Air all the time, or something like that. And that maybe it would have linked up and not been noticed during that time. But, the other side of it was, of course, to just learn more about him, learn more about the types of offenses he was committing. And that did prove valuable. And it did help us to focus a lot on Visalia, because that is such a small town back then in the 70s, and work on Visalia and the link to Sacramento, which is what we ended up trying to do later.
Okay. So then a couple of the other projects, and I'm going to turn to Kirk and Monica here, and I know there was lots of projects that you were working on, Ken, Paul was working on. Two particular projects that I thought were interesting were what I call the phone book project and the yearbook project. And I'll start with Kirk, and maybe you can kind of explain it. And I know, Kenny, you were working on a similar project with city directories, and maybe you can chime in as well. But Kirk, why don't you tell us what the phone book project was?
Well, that project was, we're basically trying to, in addition to the list we already had, but get more lists or more names from people from these various areas where he struck in both Northern and Southern California. And one way of capturing more names was to look at phone books, because back in those days, most people were actually in the phone book, unlike today. And so we tried to get as many phone books as we can from the jurisdictions where he struck during those time periods. And there was a company that we found that actually automated these phone books and put them on like in a PDF format. And so, but many of these jurisdictions and areas, time periods, what we were looking for, they weren't automated. So we ended up having to call a lot of public libraries, seeing if we could get a copy of their, Santa Barbara 1979 phone book, and telling them this was in furtherance of an investigation to identify a serial killer. So that made for some interesting conversations with some librarians.
Yeah.
And, they, oftentimes are, very reluctant to, let us have these phone books because, they were afraid they wouldn't get them back. And so we really had to give them some assurances that no, we would return them. But so we were able to get phone books from all these different jurisdictions and automate them. And we eventually got the help of an IT person from the Sacramento Police Department that created a program that would crunch all these different, we had 40 plus different lists of, suspect lists, lists from our phone books, from county crime databases, from CDCR. So we just had an endless amount of lists, school attendance lists. And that was part of it, was this yearbook project was getting even in more names of people that could possibly contain our suspect. And we're the hopes of that once we ran these number of these lists through our program, that it would eventually we would see a name that might appear on more than one list and kind of stand out. And it was kind of interesting because some investigators early on, and when the crime series was first starting, did the same kind of project, and computers were in their infancy at this time with the Lawrence Livermore lab. And it was interesting because one of the names they came up with was one of the same names that was revealed all these years later with all these multiple lists we had. So it was, it was an interesting project. Led us to a lot of potential, people that we would look into. But it also, as part of that project, we tried to recreate that Cordova Meadows area of Rancho Cordova, where he was first started out. And we used a combination of this list we investigators obtained from SMUD, the people that had moved into that area in about 1976. With the 1976 phone book, we were able to break it down further by zip code and by a list from the county assessor's office, and to really almost recreate this entire neighborhood from that time period. And it was interesting because I think that's really when I started first working with Paul. I remember getting a call from Paul saying that he had just spoken with somebody from the county assessor's department. And I guess I had spoken to him, a week or so, a few days prior to that. He says, "Hey, do you guys know each other? You might want to, give each other a call." And so I got that call from Paul. And so then we, started to, kind of collaborate on that project.
I think at the same time, Ken, you were working on a list, I think you mentioned to me, called city directories, and similar to the concept of trying to recreate neighborhoods, right?
Yeah, we found the city directories had a wealth of information in terms of address, the profession of a person. They had actually listed, what the person did for a living, names, people in the household. So we did the same thing with that list, and that Kirk's talking about in terms of trying to link people up. We also used, we had kind of surmised that given that we felt there was a pretty formal emergence into the Sacramento area in the summer of '76, given a period of adjustment that he might have had for a couple months here or there prior to those crimes starting, we decided to pursue all the utilities in the area as well, thinking that he may have come into the Sacramento area and obtained utility services. So the utility companies here locally were extremely good with us. They got us information on new startups and brand new customers and that type of information. So we had a list for that, which was vast. We went through some of the public database clearinghouses that people probably know from, the investigative side of things, and certainly the public information that's out there that you can Google and everything today. We went to those clearinghouses and asked them for geographic comparisons using some of our hotspots to see if people appeared on multiple lists. And we did get some people that did appear on multiple lists. And unfortunately, DeAngelo was not on those. And I believe I based that on the fact that he was always living just a little bit outside of the zone that we selected. So in hindsight, I probably would have broadened the radius for the searches we did. But unfortunately, when you broaden them, you get a much larger pool of people. But that's how we did it back then, thinking that he was a little closer to the center of the radius than he ended up being.
The attack took place about 10 p.m. The girl, the babysitter, the 15-year-old victim, was in the home alone at the time watching television. The suspect kicked his way through a back door into the room where the victim was located. He attacked her once in the home, and then after some phone calls came into the home, he removed her to the backyard where a second attack took place. As it turned out, the people that she was babysitting for had called the residence to check on her welfare, and when they got no response, they called her parents thinking she may have went to her home with their child, and of course she wasn't there. It was at that time that the victim's parents called the home, and that they did get one answer. The girl said hello and then hung up. As it turned out later, the suspect forced her to answer the phone and then hang it up. That's when he removed her to the backyard. The parents immediately drove to the home, and of course, when they arrived in the driveway, the suspect fled from the backyard.
And I think it's important to emphasize that these lists that are being generated, minimally there are often thousands, if not tens of thousands of names. So it was overwhelming when you start looking at that number of people.
Yeah, and it was, to me, when I remember first looking at it and seeing some of those thousands of people's names, and I would tell people about the only thing you knew at the time was that he was a white guy. That's about the most definitive piece of information. Monica, let me introduce you here and ask you to just, one of the projects that folks worked on was this, I called it the yearbook project. Maybe just tell the listeners kind of what it was and what was the goal.
Well, the thought always was that the suspect likely had gone to school in the area because he clearly knew the neighborhood so well. So we just expanded on some research that had already been done, broadened the search of the schools and transcribed the yearbooks of many of our local high schools. We ended up broadening that to junior high schools and elementary schools. Using classmates.com has yearbooks. I spent a good bit of time at the Sacramento room at our library because they have old yearbooks. Just trying to make sure we had a complete list of possible people.
And just again, and maybe Ken or Paul, he wasn't on these lists, right?
No, I know after DeAngelo, was identified, we all took a look at all these lists, that were now computerized, and DeAngelo's name didn't pop up on any of them.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. He obviously, it's the $1 million question was how was he able to get away with all this? So there was one project that was also done, and I called it the jewelry project, which, if you guys remember, he stole lots of unique types of jewelry. Kirk, you want to mention what was the jewelry project and where did it get us, if anywhere?
Well, the jewelry project was going back and looking at, most of these crimes, he would take something, often as a token, not necessarily because it had, a whole lot of value to it, but, some of these items he would take were pieces of jewelry. And so the idea was if we could try to identify some of these more unique pieces of jewelry, and then put it out there to the public that maybe somebody would recognize this piece of jewelry being, pawned or handed down to somebody or something along those lines. And so we kind of poured over all the old reports and obtained, lists of the items taken, and contacted, some of the victims and seeing if they had any photos of the jewelry still. And that's so we could put that out as a press release. And, some of the more unique pieces of jewelry ended up being class rings that we were able to go back. If, they didn't necessarily have a photo of it, we contacted the company that manufactured the class rings. These are from like Modesto Junior College or, Lycoming College, different various colleges. And so, a lot of those class rings really became some of the key pieces of jewelry that we tried to put out there.
If my memory's right, I think I talked to you guys about this idea because my sister had said, you guys should put out photographs of the jewelries because maybe somebody has it somewhere, maybe it was given. But am I correct, Paul or Ken, that none of this property has ever been located?
That's correct. We extensively searched his residence upon arrest. We used high-tech equipment, low-tech equipment, numerous investigators out there going through it, and we did not find anything that we could directly link to these offenses.
Yeah, and I talked to a family member after the arrest, a long time after the arrest, who said he saw basically melted precious metals, little nuggets of metals. And I think, some of the stolen items, he's, literally just melting them down. But I've got to think that he kept the special items and they're out there somewhere.
Right. So one of the things, with all these lists, and I'm recognizing that he wasn't on any of them. Ken, there was a project you were working on. It was the College of the Sequoias project. And maybe you can kind of explain to the listeners, what was it? And do you think if it had gotten all the way through, do you think you would have ended up on the list?
Yeah, so the College of the Sequoias during the ransacking series seemed to be a real center point geographically for his activities down there. And I think I mentioned earlier that he would hit right around the college when he was under some pressure from the investigation down there. We know that the professor who was killed, Mr. Snelling, was a professor at the College of the Sequoias there in Visalia. So having seen some of the links between the ransacker and the Cordova cat burglar and the Cordova Meadows burglar, we figured that was a good place to take a look and see if we could get a list. And we were looking for people on that list that might have relocated to the Sacramento area, because we felt very strongly that he was definitely a resident of Sacramento during the crimes, or the general Sacramento area. And then we had come to believe that there was a very good possibility. We didn't eliminate people if they didn't have Visalia ties, but we felt there was a very strong possibility he was also linked to Visalia. So we had authored a warrant for the College of the Sequoias, attempting to find white male students between basically the ages of 18 and 35, is I believe how we did it. It might have been up to 40, I don't remember, but we wanted a listing of those names for the period of time when he would have been active down there, and into the time period when he would be active up here. So we had put it from 72 to I believe it was 76. And we were in the progress of getting that warrant signed and sent down there when the case broke. So we ended up going back and serving them with paper in terms of a search warrant for records specifically on Mr. DeAngelo. And he did pop up as having had a student relationship with the school via the academy he'd attended and some other classwork he took there. So he would have been on the list. It would have, as I think Paul or Kirk mentioned, I think it was thousands of people that come up on these lists. And if you're talking about white male students at a college, I imagine we would have been in the thousands with that. So it would have taken us a very large amount of time to get through it.
Right.
But I'd like to think that maybe we would have gone alphabetically, and since he was D, maybe we'd have seen a Sacramento
Right.
tie and dug deep. But again, that was a long shot that we were throwing out there, and I'm glad it didn't have to happen, because we ended up getting him the easier way than that.
Right.
Not
So
easier for me,
before-
or not easier for Kirk
Right.
and Monica, but easier for me.
Right. So before I transition to kind of really the pinnacle of the projects here on genealogy, I wanted to mention one thing that I don't think you guys were involved in, but during the course of this whole thing, we realized that Nevada, so every state in the country has a law that allows you to collect DNA from felons. And we realized through this whole case that Nevada had a law, but their law was not what we call retroactive, meaning that there was plenty of people in prison in Nevada, many, serial killers or sexual rapists, whatever, that their DNA had not yet been collected. And so a group of DAs realizing that, oh my goodness, the guy could be sitting in prison in Nevada and we don't know it. So we actually went to Nevada, not physically, but we made calls, worked with the Nevada DAs and the Attorney General's office, and they decided to go ahead and apply their law retroactively. And this is, to me, is kind of a cool thing that came out of this situation. It didn't solve the Golden State Killer, but as a result of them re-looking at their law and applying it retroactively, they then went out and collected DNA from a lot of people in their prison system, and in fact solved some pretty significant crime sprees, including a guy from Colorado that was responsible or accused, I should say, of killing, I think, 4 people in Colorado. Paula, you probably remember that guy, a guy named Ewing, I think his name is.
Yeah, I vaguely remember the case, but I think, that's what this Golden State Killer case did, is it had such huge ramifications, on laws, both within the state of California, Prop 69, and then Larry Poole, kind of going after death row inmates in California, and then you spearheading, the Nevada side, so it as we were trying to solve this case, it improved public safety in California by those change in laws.
And Paul, kind of just, how did you, you get the credit for the idea of this idea of what we call genetic genealogy. And at some point you started working with an FBI guy named Steve Kramer, right?
Yeah.
So how did you come up with this concept? And if my memory's right, it was sometime around the fall of 2017.
Right. It was actually predates that. I was doing a different type of genealogy using YSTRs, looking for paternal relatives of the East Area rapist. And then in February 2017, just coincidentally on a completely unrelated case, homicide in 2002, I get called into a conference call with Peter Headley from San Bernardino Sheriff's Office. And there had been a little girl associated with that other homicide case who we were sure she had been abducted from somewhere in the nation, spent 15 years trying to identify her. Well, Peter Headley reached out to DNAadoption.com and worked with the genealogist, Barbara Ray Venter, actually identified this now an adult woman, but at the time of when, she was 6 years old at the time that she was recovered, identified her. And I was asking Peter, how did you do that? And how was this done? And he brought up Barbara's name. And so my wheels were spinning because I was already sort of on the genealogy path, just a different technology. So I go back to my office and I give Barbara a call. And Barbara, asked me what I've got. I don't tell her what case I'm working. I just said it's a big case. So we had some previous work, phenotyping work done. I sent her some snippets of that report, and Barbara just happened to say, as we were saying our goodbyes, well, too bad you don't have SNPs. And I, kind of like, well, I know what SNPs are from a science standpoint, but I didn't know how they were being used in genealogy. And at this point, Barbara dropped off the radar. She wasn't returning my communications. I was pursuing some other leads, and they fell apart. And then Steve Kramer from the FBI calls me up after our very last task force meeting in March of 2017 up there in the Sacramento area, and said, hey, Paul, I hear you're pursuing DNA and genealogy. I kind of believe in that. How can I help? And so that's how Steve Kramer and I first started, working together. And then we just, did a deep dive as we were learning the technology.
So then, if I'm correct, and because I want to get to kind of like the culmination of all this, but you come to our office in November of 2017. You had found some additional DNA from the Ventura case of Charlene Smith. Fortunately, the pathologist had kept a secondary sample. So November of 2017, you come in. Monica, if my memory's right, first of all, it was you, me, and Paul and Monica. And even though I think I understand DNA pretty well, I would be remiss if I didn't admit that my eyes glassed over a little bit in trying to understand what this whole new thing was. Fair to say, Paul, or Kirk and Monica, did you feel the same way, or was I just missing the beat here?
Oh no, it was like
Monica.
Greek to us at that time.
Are you saying my presentation on the DNA was boring?
No,
our
not at
understanding
all.
of it was very limited.
Oh,
It was tough. But one thing I will say is that you came, I think around 1 o'clock. A couple hours later, Monica said to me, I have a good feeling about this. We get Paul, you take the sample, you send it out to get what is called SNPs, which is just really it's a testing procedure that gives you way more information that you can look for relatedness, correct?
that's correct in the simplest terms, sure.
Okay, so then when was it that the next step, so you got this, what we call the SNP, then you have to essentially, and I'm not going to go into the specifics of this case because we're very cautious about privacy and all those kinds of things, but there's this concept of tree building. So Kirk or Monica or Paul, or whoever wants to answer, like, what does that in general mean when we talk about tree building?
Basically what you're doing with tree building is, doing the genealogy of it is you take these lists of people that are related to your suspect, and it's the term of measurement they use is called centimorgans. And it's basically the more centimorgans somebody shares with somebody, the more closely related they are. And you're basically looking for a common ancestor between matches that are related to one another. In other words, these matches are related, share DNA with your person you're trying to identify, your suspect, but they're also related to each other. So you try to identify a common ancestor between these related matches in your suspect, and then you build down from that common. First, you build up to that common ancestor, identifying that common ancestor, we call the most recent common ancestor, and then you build down in your tree to get to the level of where your potential suspect could be based off the amount of DNA they share with your suspect.
So during this process, I mean, I remember very distinctly that, so for the listeners, Monica's office is on the same floor as mine. And at one point, I was probably going to her office every other day saying, what's happening? What's going on? And at one point I went in at the beginning stages and I said, is this going to work? And Monica, do you remember what you said to me?
I think I said something along the lines of, this is the best hope we have, or this is the only thing we have. Because at that point, I really felt like every other avenue had been exhausted.
I just remember after Paul had explained it and, and after a while that it sunk in, I think I was overly optimistic. I thought, with Monica's research ability and everything, I said, well, we'll probably solve this in a couple of days. So obviously I was a little overly optimistic on that one, but I've learned now they can take quite a lot longer than a couple months on some cases. But I was really excited and very confident, thinking this is really, really interesting.
Kenny, had you heard anything about any of this genealogy stuff, or did you have any understanding of it?
Yeah, well, again, like Paul mentioned, he had been working extensively with both sides of the investigation. He was somebody who we were basically doing regular detective work with. And at the same time, he also had responsibility for the DNA side of this task force. So Paul had already gone into a lot of the why stuff. He had come up a couple of times with some very promising information. And I knew the limitations. I knew what he was up against in terms of what we needed for a DNA sample to go into that type of system. And so he did make me aware sometime around then that he was working very hard on getting this into an autosomal format. He explained that it would give us some relatedness to a potential person and link back. And I remember the day he popped into the office and basically said he had what he thought could be a very strong lead into somebody who was potentially related to our offender. And it was pretty stunning. I mean, he explained it to me in the office, and I said, absolutely, that's something to run with. And he continued down that path. And that would be, I would say, just a short period of time, and I'd say months. And Paul, you might register in, but it's not long after that things started really moving in a real positive direction. And it was interesting. I'll tell you, it was a new thing, and it was hard to understand. But once Paul did explain it, it made sense that was a good way to identify this individual, even if he didn't have any tie to the system, as we know from CODIS and everything else, family DNA.
Well, it's interesting, Paul, was because I kept pushing Monica. I probably was a pest, but one day I went in there and I said, "What's happening? What's going on?" And she said, "Well, there's this guy. He's kind of interesting. He's probably a little bit too old, though. I'm not sure." And then, I don't know, a day or two later, I went back in and said, "What's happening? What's going on?" And she said, "Well, I found this police report, and that he had, been involved in a petty theft, a dog repellent, and a hammer, and he's a former cop." And at least for me, that was one of those aha moments, like, okay, this is real. This is real. We're on to something here. It was quite extraordinary.
From my perspective, I was very skeptical, just because having, looked at so many guys and having so many guys circumstantially add up only to be eliminated, it was just, okay, he's got some interesting geographic ties. He's got an interesting background. As you know, he had a ex-fiance named Bonnie. But at the same time, I've had other guys like that. So I was skeptical up until the very end. I think, Ken was the one, as, we're talking, Ken is getting more and more excited. And if you don't know, Ken can get very excitable. And as he's talking to me, he's almost convincing me, as I was like, oh, I don't know, so.
Right. So Kenny, you then were tasked with the surveillance on this person, right? Maybe you can kind of walk the listeners through, like, what was that like?
Well, we had done other surveillances on other people. And as Paul said, we had some very good suspects over the years. Paul and I were picking what year champagne we wanted to burst open. We had many of these people that came and went, and it was, you enter the doldrums. There's a period of, you step away from it for a few days or longer, you come back. And so when this thing broke and we knew that this was very likely going to be the offender, we had to get a DNA sample to confirm it, and it had to be one directly from him. We had all assumed that if this offender, when he was identified, became aware that he'd been identified, that he would implement some type of end game plan. We didn't know what that was. We didn't know if it would involve harm to others, harm to himself, escape. We didn't know. But we did not want him to have that advantage. So we kept it very quiet. It was very amazing to me that it did stay quiet the whole time. And so we put a surveillance team on him that included some outside resources and also our local fugitive apprehension team guys that do that here. And they basically went about surveilling him to try and get a surreptitious DNA sample from him. It was to our advantage a bit that we had so many false alarms, because they just figured it was just another one of, Ken's larks that he's sending us off on. So they, went about it with the same professionalism they always do, but it really didn't tip anybody's hand. There was nobody, feeling that there was anything more about this than there was any of the others I had sent up. And then we moved to 24-hour surveillance. And then I think that kind of, I would say, tipped the hand a little bit that this was a more serious individual. Homicide detectives took the night shift because we figured it wasn't a matter of him moving. We wanted our better guys doing the daytime stuff. And so we took the night shift and just waited him out. And during that surveillance, we saw him definitely doing some counter surveillance. It appeared as though he had been spooked by something. I have my theories, but in any event, he took us on a couple of pretty good anti or counter surveillance runs that we ended up deciding that we needed to pull back even further. So we ended up getting it through a different means, and we ended up finding enough of a sample that the lab had about 20 items to test from the medium that we got the sample from. And it was, I believe, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, Anne-Marie, that it was the last sample they tested that yielded the DNA, I was told. So all those things we
Right.
took that looked so positive yielded nothing. And then one item that was taken at the very end as an afterthought gave us the full profile.
So to be clear, just to make sure the listeners understand that you guys did surveillance that ultimately the first sample was from Hobby Lobby. It was a door handle sample. And then there was another secondary sample. But I want to kind of focus on that initial sample, because that's what really generated where we were and where we were leading, where the whole case was going to go. And I just want to tell you what happened was, you guys get the sample. We rush it to our crime lab because we're very fortunate to have our own crime lab. And I'm going to speak for myself. So I remember this Friday, it was Friday, April 20th. It went to the lab. I had to go to a dinner that night, a great high school called Cristo Rey High School. And I remember distinctly telling our chief deputy at the time, Steve Grippy, who oversees the lab, I'm like, you better call me if anything happens on that. So I'm standing at this dinner reception, and I get a call from Steve Grippy. And he essentially said, "Are you sitting down?" And I would have to say that I probably grilled him more about, what do you mean? What does this mean? I challenged him. And Paul can understand this because I was asking very detailed questions about the DNA. And finally, he just said, "All I'm telling you is that it matches, and the lab people are shaking." And then I knew, okay. So for me, then I picked up the phone. As soon as I got off that call, I knew I couldn't really talk to hardly anybody, but I called the sheriff. And then I called Kirk and Monica. And so then from there, I just want to kind of ask you, maybe Kirk, you called Paul, right?
Yes, after I got the call from you, and I remember exactly, where I was, and it's one of those times in your life where you know exactly where you were, and I remember exactly what road I was driving on and pulled over. But yeah, and so as soon as I got that from you, and it was like, and I think a lot of us, relate to this, but it was like a surreal moment after all these years to get that information, and it's really it's hard to believe, at that point. Yeah. But yeah, so as soon as I got off the phone with you, I immediately called Paul.
Yeah, and I was retired, out of state, shopping for a house, eating dinner with my wife. I see, Kirk is calling me. I step out just thinking it's another update on the surveillance. And as soon as I was like, "Hi, Kirk." It wasn't the typical Kirk. It was, "You can't tell anybody what this is about." So I knew this was going to be a different phone call. And then Kirk, at that time, you said something along the lines, "I'm not entirely sure what this means," because I was kind of asking you questions about what exactly do they have from a DNA, and you're like, "I don't know exactly what it means, but they've got 21 markers." And I just know, I remember saying, "That's him." There you go. That was my moment of, okay, this process worked. And the tingling was happening as I went back into the restaurant.
So Kenny, tell me how you found out.
Well, I had received a phone call. I was at my house, and the initial sample that you talked about, I had word on that, and was kind of given, in lay terms, it was like, "Hey, we need one in, 50 million, and this is like one in 28 million. I'm like, "Well, okay, well, that's pretty good." Well, again, it's not definitive, but we had to double our efforts and get all of the good samples over to the lab immediately. So I had a feeling it was obviously our guy, and everything pointed to that. So once we got that second sample in, I would say that the phone call I got was a bit more expected, because I didn't think there was any way somebody could be that close on a door handle sample and, all of a sudden fall away. So when I got the call, it came from a chief in our department who had been my captain in the unit. We've been beat partners together in patrol, and I'd known him for years. And he said, "I can't believe it." And he thought that I knew. So I said, "You can't believe what?" And he's like, "You haven't heard." I said, "I think I know what you're going to tell me, but I haven't heard for sure." And he said, "It's him. You guys got him." And I was like, okay, well, time to go to work. So then I started making phone calls and went immediately to my office. We'd already had a good framework warrant going, and Paul showed up there. Our sex assaults supervisor, Michelle Hendricks, who's a good friend of ours, had also come over and assisted us with the authorship of that warrant. And basically, Paul and I sat down with some framework warrants that he had from some other efforts related to this case, and some framework warrants that I had, some authored by Detective Rob Peters, who was our lead detective at the time, because as I said, I was a sergeant, so I was in the different job then. But we sat down and pounded out the arrest warrant for Mr. DeAngelo.
So before we kind of talk about the finality of the arrest, Monica, how did it feel to you when you got the word that all this work had, what you thought was a pretty good idea, turned out to be actually true?
Well, I kind of echo Paul's sentiment. I mean, logically, I think we all had to know, this is the guy. But there had been so many false alarms over the years. I almost feel like we were conditioned to be set up for disappointment. And so I just kind of didn't let myself get too excited. But so really, when you made that phone call to Kirk and I, it was very surreal. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. I was on my way to go to dinner with friends and my husband, and I was sitting through that entire dinner thinking, how am I going to get through the next few days without telling anybody this until the arrest? It was mind-boggling.
Yeah, that was a challenge because it was such a big deal. And I mean, I remember the night of when he was arrested, and we can talk about that in a second, but being at the sheriff's office, Ken and Paul, and being over there and with him being in that interview room. And I got an email from a news channel asking if it was true. And I just ignored it because it was such an important part of this process. And but Kenny and Paul, you guys worked on the warrants. Our office, I know it was a very close circle. Myself, our chief deputy, and our head of homicide, Rod Norgard, and Steve Grippy, reviewed all of those. And then you guys, then you went over and had it signed by, was it Judge White, Ken?
Yes, it was. Yeah, I took it to him in the afternoon, same day we made the arrest, and it had been polished up. It looked very nice, and it was related to and specifically for the murder of Brian and Katie Maggiore. So that is the warrant that was taken and signed by Judge White.
Okay. And then obviously you guys arrested him, about an hour or two later after the warrant was signed?
Yes, I had, hit 5 o'clock traffic. I was driving on my way there. I told the apprehension team that don't wait for me. If they can, great. If you can't, don't worry about it. But I did not want him being arrested in the home. I wanted them to wait until he was outside the residence and could not get back into the residence to be able to implement any type of end game plan he might have. And that's exactly what happened. I was lucky enough to get picked up at a local business by one of the fugitive team guys who I'd worked with for many years. And I sat in the passenger seat, and literally as we pulled up onto the street, the word came over that he was outside the residence and had, but they believe had gone far enough away from any access point to the house that he would not be able to get to it before the team closed in. And so I said, go ahead. And they moved in and made the arrest right there on the front of his property.
And Paul, were you there at the time of the arrest?
Yeah, I was back at homicide listening to the arrest go down over the radio. So what I remember is, their commander on the radio was basically gave the green light, and then we just had radio silence. So I wasn't seeing, none of us were seeing what's going on. So you're holding your breath. And then all of a sudden, the next thing is suspect in custody, and that conference room just erupted. Guys were giving high fives, and I'm not a high five kind of guy, but I was, kind of just thinking, okay, at least that went good. But now, now is going to be the interview, and now the wheels are spinning on my side, and right. What's the next steps? That's where I was at.
Morning, everybody. For those of you that don't know, my name is Anne Marie Schubert. I'm the District Attorney of Sacramento County. Let me first by saying this. The answer has always been in Sacramento. For over 40 years, countless victims have waited for justice. For many of us, it was more than a professional commitment. It became personal for many of us. There were upwards of 50 rapes, 12 murders, crimes that spanned 10 years across at least 10 different counties, northern, central, and southern California. The answer was and always was going to be in the DNA. We were looking for a needle in a haystack, but we also all knew that the needle was there. Yesterday, an arrest warrant was issued, a complaint was filed charging that individual with 2 counts of murder with special circumstances for the murder of Brian and Katie Maggiore here in Sacramento in February 1978. We found the needle in the haystack, and it was right here in Sacramento.
He was ultimately convicted last summer. In 2020, he pled guilty to all the charges, admitted really all the uncharged crimes as well. And as I say this, and we kind of wrap this podcast up, I do think this was a journey for justice that began, well over 40 years ago. And without these innovative ideas, and there's no doubt in my mind that had this idea of genealogy not been hatched, he would never have been brought to justice. But just to end this all, I kind of want to just get your sense, and I'll start with Ken, what do you take away from this case?
Well, it was the pinnacle of the long-term investigation. At many points during the time I was working it, we, having had other cases, we had much going on. There was plenty of opportunity to kind of step away from it and not continue. I had met several of the victims of the sexual assault series here in Sacramento, was motivated by them, was motivated to see this through. And so I think that, perseverance in these cases is the key. And, I'm not the only investigator, and neither is Paul or Kirk or Monica, but these cases are always built on a foundation of the original investigators and the passion that they had and the work they did and the documentation they completed in those crimes. And I think we built on that. We basically took what was a very solid foundation, and yes, had mistakes over the years and everything that always comes with these, but managed to use the current technology and see a conclusion to something that was really, when you go back, really 45 years plus in the making. And it was stunning. It really was. And then having it bust open the way it did and being a watershed event for so dozens, I imagine into hundreds now, cases around the country, truly the worst of the worst people that are now behind bars, and victims have justice. That it's really a wonderful feeling.
Awesome. That's great. Monica, how about you?
I mean, I agree with Ken. There were so many amazing detectives that have worked on this case throughout the years. Some had spent their entire careers on it and even kept working on it, after retirement. So I was really honored and felt like it was a privilege to be able to be part of the team, at the end that helped, get to the culmination of all those years of hard work. And, it's well over 100 cases now that have been solved by genetic genealogy. And, if not for this case, I wonder, where we'd be today with that.
Yep, no doubt about that. Kirk, how about you?
Yeah, it's just really a groundbreaking event for law enforcement. I think it's the biggest. Genetic genealogy is probably the biggest breakthrough in law enforcement in my career. Since DNA itself, and it was to play a part in that. It was definitely a privilege, and it's a testament to all the hard work of all these investigators over decades, that had dedicated their careers to getting this case solved. So it definitely was an honor to play a part in that, for sure.
How about you, Paul?
Well, in addition to what everybody else has said, I think, Anne Marie, you and I were chatting, after victim impact statements, and how powerful they were. And I think it really underscored that even on a case like this, where you have, attacks that occurred, crimes that occurred 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it still has meaning to those people that were affected, either directly or because they lost a loved one.
I'm speaking her impact statement because she is ill at home. On June 17th, 1976, I went to bed not knowing that in just a few hours, my life as I knew it would change.
We were home inside a locked house where we should have been safe. Mr. DeAngelo broke in and woke up my sister and tied her up. He then came to my room and woke me up with his hand over my mouth. After rolling out of bed and swinging at him, I was hit several times on the head before being tied up, gagged, and blindfolded.
Did what I had to do to stay alive. He stole my car and my purse, which meant he knew my own address on my license and registration. Because of that, I moved out of my apartment so he couldn't find me and my children.
I still have a lot of questions I wish could be answered. Why us? How did the defendant know my parents were out of town and that my sister and I were home alone?
Survivor who protected her family and had the courage and the bravery to survive that night.
It is inconceivable that such a creature exists in this world. May he rot in hell.
The way that we all came together, to work the case. I mean, this was a true culmination of a team effort, and, everybody played a part in it. And then we've seen the ramifications, just like trying to investigate the case when it was unsolved and all the changes that happened in California and Nevada, as you brought up, Anne Marie, but now nationwide, worldwide, how this case has reverberated in terms of the ability to solve the worst of the worst types of crimes with the technology that was employed to catch Joseph DeAngelo.
Excellent. For me, when I look back on this case, I consider it the greatest testament to passion and persistence by law enforcement and all of those folks that worked on this case for so long. And really, each of you has resonated the most important part, which is that the crime has real consequences and there are real victims here. In this particular case, devastated hundreds of, if not thousands of peoples, and it really had an impact on communities as well. So for me, I think when I look back, I'm just incredibly honored and humbled by what was done and really ultimately the passion and persistence that brought this case to a conclusion. So for each of you, I want to thank you each individually: Paul Holes, Ken Clark, Monica Zakowski, and Kirk Campbell. And just to wrap this up, I want to start with what we began with, which is the purpose of this podcast, Inside the Crime Files, is really to demonstrate the innovative techniques that are used to solve crime, the inspirational stories that come out of crime. And this case is probably the greatest example we'll see in that. So thank you all very much for being part of this episode.
Thanks, Henry.
I wasn't sure what they were, so I came out and I heard the third shot about halfway down the driveway, and a scream and glass breaking, and I heard about two more as I stood out here, and then I can hear a little bit of running, and then somebody hopping over the fence just right down the street, and I could hear him falling in the bushes, and it took him a few seconds to get out of the bushes, but I could tell he was really scrambling, and he came running down right down the sidewalk, and came right up on the lawn next to the tree, and right as he came to the tree, he looked up and he saw me standing right here, and he was pretty surprised, and he just turned around as quick as he could. He just turned around and just headed straight down there towards the fire hydrant around the corner.
I am Anne Marie Schubert, and this is Inside the Crime Files.